They were supposed to watch over him, just keep him in line.
A hugely controversial story. We first showed you that incident caught on tape.
Students gathered this afternoon at Cleveland Plaza and
marched
marched to the Capitol.
Martin Luther King was correct to speak of a moral universe. That's where we live. And that's why we all care so much about justice, even if we disagree about how such justice should be achieved. But of all the events that might have lit the fuse, why did Floyd's death affect us so profoundly? In a sense, this whole book is an answer to that question. Floyd's death gripped us because our moral universe has been birthed out of similar pains. It was an echo of what happened on a hill outside Jerusalem 2 millennia before. An unarmed victim of oppression, an uncaring authority, a public and humiliating death, and a world that came to see the virtue of the victim and the tyranny of the oppressor.
In The Air We Breathe, we go through these 7 values. We go through the values of equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. These have now become so assumed in our culture. We think that they are obvious, natural, and universal. They are nothing of the sort. And yet, nowadays, equality, of course, if anyone thinks of unequal societies, we are instantly thinking that is a perversion. If anyone is cruel, we can't stand cruelty or inequality. We can't stand coercion instead of consent. We can't stand being unenlightened. We can't stand anything that is anti-science. We hate the idea of things being restrictive rather than free, and we hate the idea of things being regressive rather than progressive. All of our moral imaginations have been shaped by the Jesus Revolution. But what does that mean? I think so much of what that means is today we want the kingdom without the king. We want the kingdom of Christ without Christ himself. And what we are left with, therefore, is a whole bunch of values. Values are good, but the problem with values is that they are impersonal, abstract things that stand above us and can only judge us. Are you compassionate? Do you always uphold human equality? Do you always honor consent in every relationship? Are you always on the side of enlightenment, always on the side of progress? Are you always on the side of freedom and science and all these things? I have to say, no, I am not. I am guilty. And yet, what do we do in a godless world when we feel guilty? Well, we just sort of shift it around a bit and we point the finger. You know, Dostoevsky said, well over 100 years ago now, he said that without God, everything is permitted. But I think what we're finding these days is that without God, everything is very preachy. And we're all pointing the finger at everyone else's failures in this. We have a kind of a semi-Christianity. And a semi-Christianity is really bad news. Charles Spurgeon, the old 19th century preacher, he said, if you be half a Christian, then you have enough religion to make you miserable. Now, I think that's what we've got. Nowadays, we've got enough religion to make us miserable because we know the law, we know something of what we ought to be like, but we have no means of redemption, no means of forgiveness. What do we need? We need the kingdom with the king. We need the Christ who embodies these values, because these values are very personal values. It's odd to believe in human rights and human equality and for them to remain abstracted, depersonalized values. They're crying out for a person who is their source. Well, Christ is the source of these things. We need the person of Jesus. We need to fall in love with the person of Christ rather than adhere to the values of Christ. We also need the forgiveness of Christ for when we fail these values, because we all fail these values. So for those who believe in these kind of kingdom values, what we really need is a king to embody them, and a savior to forgive us when we fail. Jordan Peterson is a psychologist who's long been fascinated by the impact of the Bible on the modern world. He was in conversation with another YouTuber called Jonathan Pageau when he said, "I've got the choice of believing two impossible things. I can either believe that the world is constituted so that God took on flesh and was crucified and rose 3 days later, or I can believe that human beings invented this unbelievably preposterous story that has stretched into every atom of culture. And it isn't obvious to me that the second hypothesis is any easier to believe than the first. Because the more you investigate the manifestations of the story of Christ, the more insanely complicated and far-reaching it becomes." Do you see what Peterson is saying? He's saying, okay, the Christian story is preposterous. God takes flesh, dies for the world, and is raised up again. Okay, that's a nuts story, and we've seen why that's a nuts story. But if you don't think that happened, what you instead have to think is that people invented that most preposterous story, and having invented that most preposterous story, it has worked itself on the human heart and worked itself into human societies such that it has transformed the world beyond all imagination. The world has been made by that man on the cross, right? The moral world, your moral sensibilities, the moral sensibilities of all of us in the modern times, the modern sensibilities that say we should live by equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress, the modern world has been made by that man on a cross. Now, why? What is the power in that man on a cross to make the world? Well, Christians come along and we just say, well, maybe it's because he's our maker. Maybe he has made the world in the moral sense because he is our maker. And at that stage, you're like, well, then I've got to believe in this improbable story of God taking flesh and dying on a cross and rising again. Yes, you do have to believe in that miracle. But if you reject that miracle, you have to embrace another kind of improbability. That somehow this very improbable story was invented by humans, and that it had such a profound effect on human hearts and on human cultures. And in my final chapter of The Air We Breathe, I talk about the progress of Christianity from the most improbable beginnings to world domination. And I ask the question, how do you go from God-forsaken crucifixion to world domination? That's quite a miracle. But it's a miracle that has actually happened. You know, it's the ultimate water into wine miracle. I don't know if you believe in the water into wine miracle, but that was the first miracle in John's Gospel. Jesus turns water into wine. Now, you might not think that happened, but you must believe in this other miracle. This other miracle is that the one who is executed in God-forsaken agony dominates the world, right? That is quite the water into wine story. And it has definitely happened. And you're living within the world that crucified man has made. What do you make of that? In the chapter, I talk about the improbability of these origins producing such a global effect, and I talk about the fact that it was predicted, okay? The Old Testament predicted that there would be one coming, right back in the Garden of Eden. It was predicted that just the offspring of a woman would crush the head of evil, even as he himself was struck. You know, you've got these foreshadowings of the virgin birth of Jesus, his death on the cross, and his victory over evil. And throughout the Old Testament, you get this idea of the Messiah coming, and the Messiah would suffer, and yet the Messiah would rise, and the Messiah would bring about a global kingdom. In Daniel chapter 2, you get this idea of a small stone that is cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands. And it crashes into, in Daniel chapter 2, a massive statue that represents all the great superpowers of the ancient world. And somehow, this tiny, ignominious stone kind of crashes into all the empires of this world. They all crumble to dust, but this stone grows to become a mountain that fills and has dominion over the whole earth. Incredible. From little things, big things grow. Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Isaiah 9. All these great prophecies of from little things, big things grow. And then Jesus comes onto planet Earth. He says, yes, I am that one. And he says that his kingdom will grow like yeast working its way through a batch of dough. Or he says he's like the mustard seed that's the smallest seed in the garden. And what happens? That goes down into the ground and dies. It rises up and it grows into the biggest tree that enfolds everything else. Jesus is making that prediction when he's just a matter of months away from God-forsaken execution. How do you go from God-forsaken execution to world domination? It is a miracle. It's a very improbable miracle. It is a predicted miracle. And it is the miracle that we are living within. What do you make of Jesus? What do you make of the Jesus revolution? And which miracle are you going to choose?
What's the most memorable thing that you've learned whilst writing this book, The Air We Breathe? What struck you?
Oh, gosh. I think, so I've got those 7 values. They actually map onto 7 different epochs. So equality maps onto Old Testament era, compassion maps onto New Testament, consent maps onto the early church, enlightenment maps onto the medieval period. And that was the big... that was the big myth-busting moment for me, because I don't know if when you think of the medieval period, don't you think of the Dark Ages? And like historians don't call them the Dark Ages anymore because it's difficult to call a period that invented the university and parliaments and human rights and cathedrals and Chaucer and Dante. It's hard to call that dark actually when you look at it, and so gaining a greater appreciation for all the light that was there in that 1,000-year period was, that was a real, that really overturned some prejudices that I had, you know.
Could it not be argued that we're trying to attribute things to Christianity that could just as easily be attributed to non-Christians?
I guess the part of that question I want to press into is, like, who's the we? Could it not be argued that we are trying to attribute things to Christianity? And, like, honestly, it's not just Christians who are doing this. Those people who don't believe in human rights, for instance, very often they don't believe in it because it's Christian. And you know, Yuval Noah Harari, we looked at a clip of his yesterday, and he's just very clear. You know, human rights have come to us through the Bible. Abolitionism was a profoundly Christian movement, and particularly Quakers and evangelicals uniting in this country. And in order to enforce the abolition of the slave trade to Catholic and Muslim lands, they had to sort of translate the language of we're in the image of God and this is a sin against the Creator. In order to really spread that view around the world, they had to start saying, instead of it being a sin against the Creator, it's a crime against humanity. And they had to secularize the language in order to have it sort of accepted by Muslim and Catholic lands. And so a lot of the gains of Christianity have been kind of anonymous gains and kind of secularized in the language that comes out. So I guess we just have to go through each of these values and figure out who are the non-Christians in particular that could be said to have founded these values.
Did the values like compassion not exist before Jesus in ancient times, as you mentioned, or did they exist in a different way?
Everyone loves their children, you know. I mentioned a saying from the Roman Empire that every day you should do something helpful for your friend and something harmful for your enemy. Every day you should do that. And it sounds like just very prosaic advice, the sort of thing that you would cross-stitch and sort of put on a wall hanging somewhere. You know, harm your enemy and help your friend. And to be honest, that is how we tick. That is how the human animal ticks, okay? We are tribal creatures. And of course, we are very compassionate to those who are in our tight circle, and if they're lovely, and if our blood sugar is, you know, sufficiently elevated, then we will love the lovely. That's what all of us are like. And I don't care what race, religion, time period you live in. Of course, we're all compassionate in that sense. But the idea that you should love your enemies is so bonkers. So bonkers. You know, you get Nietzsche jumping up and down in the 19th century. It's like basically saying, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Why are we loving enemies? This is so dumb. It's Christianity. Christianity has done this. It's made you mad. And then, you know, he dies of madness. But like in a sense, he's not wrong about how different Christianity is and how we have just become acclimatized to this idea of loving every single member of the human family right to the very fringes, including the weakest and the least and the last and the lost and even your enemies we are to have compassion on. All bonkers, nuts. And the other thing to say is in bringing these values to our attention, it actually becomes really, really condemning. And what have we found as a society as we've walked away from confessional Christianity and going to church and actually believing in the King of the Kingdom? What we've done is we've gotten rid of the King of the Kingdom, we've clung on to the values of the kingdom. And now we are living in such a judgmental atmosphere, aren't we? Where we're very sure about equality and compassion and very sure that that person is violating equality and compassion. And it's an astonishing development, isn't it? Like, I think the prediction from the 20th century was that as people walked away from confessional Christianity, we would become less sure of our morality, less sure of our own righteousness. Has that been the case? That has not been the case. We are ever more sure of who the terrible people are, and they're all over there, right? We have not become amoral. We've become incredibly moral and incredibly moralistic. Because if values are all you have, well, values cannot forgive you. Values can only judge you. You need a person to forgive you, right? And that's another reason why Okay, look at the values, step 1. Step 2, realize that you do not live up to those values at all. You violate them all the time. But step 3, praise God that if you pull the thread at those values, on the far side, there's a person. And that is your salvation, because values cannot forgive you. Values can only condemn you. A person can forgive you. And here is Christ, full of compassion for you. And so actually, through looking into these values, you can go through a whole kind of gospel narrative of here is the good life, we fail, Christ succeeds on our behalf and forgives us and sets us on our feet and sends us out into the world to live out his kind of life. So I'm not at all trying to diminish sin or the sins of Christians. I'm actually calling out the sins of Christians. But hallelujah, we've got a Savior who embodies those values, but he does more than embody them. He actually forgives us for when we fail them. That's what we really need.
How do we actually help people begin to question the foundations of their belief and values in a sort of one-to-one context?
I mean, it's really difficult in a one-to-one context. I've obviously done a lot of research for the book, but that doesn't mean I'm brilliant in a one-to-one conversation, bringing it around to this topic and navigating the various waters of it. There are some things that actually a book is the best thing to give to someone and say, go away, or a podcast or a short video. Yeah. There are some things that you won't get to the bottom of in just a short conversation. I think in a short conversation, what I'd urge you to do is do what I was saying about the seed. Just constantly be thinking, how can I talk about my church? That's what I love about my church. That's what I love about Jesus. I couldn't have gotten through X without Jesus. I don't think you have to have great philosophical arguments to be able to witness to your friends. Fascinatingly, the Jesus Revolution has kind of done its thing through something as weak and ignominious as just the seed, as just these weak little conversations that we have, dropping in a word about Jesus here and there, and he is the one who grows his kingdom. So don't worry about having incredibly deep conversations with people. Befriend them, love them, talk to them winsomely about Jesus, and that seed will find good soil.
Great. Thank you so much.
We've got Andrea, who asked, I have a question probably millions ask. Why is cancer and dementia something that happens to innocent people? She's speaking from personal experience. Her mum's a loving, generous person and has been diagnosed with dementia. And another family member is a young, innocent child with cancer.
You're right, that is the question that millions ask, billions ask. We're always asking why. The Bible is continually asking why. You might know about the book of Job. It might be the oldest written down book in the Bible. And it's a man who goes through intolerable suffering. For chapter after chapter after chapter, he asks the question why 20 times. Or you go to the next book in the Bible, the book of Psalms, which are like songs and poems, prayers to God, and they ask the why question even more, to the point where you have these psalms where people of God are just saying, why, my God, have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? These are the sorts of things that Christians ask all the time, because we are very aware that the world is not as it should be. And I think one of the real tricks with the problem of evil is to make sure that it's a problem. Mm-hmm. The most horrible answer I could give to this question is, oh, yeah, there's horrible things that happen in the world, and cancer and dementia, but here's the answer. Because of X, Y, and Z, that justifies cancer and dementia. That would be like not just an unsatisfying answer. I think that would be a morally wrong answer for me to say, here are some truths that totally counterbalance suffering and mean that suffering in the end is okay. Mm-hmm. I don't think the Bible does that. What the Bible does is tell a story. And it's a true story, but it's a story in which God enters into suffering and suffers the most and plumbs the depths of our suffering and evil on that cross in order to rise again and offer us a future that is beyond that suffering. But what God doesn't do is from heaven just shout down advice or say it's not that bad or just cling on, not long till heaven now. There's this amazing story of Jesus showing up at a funeral. His best friend has just died, called Lazarus, and his sisters give word to him. And bafflingly, Jesus hears about when Lazarus is ill, and he delays, and he doesn't come to Lazarus. And actually, in that delay, Lazarus dies. And so instead of Jesus going to heal the sick man, which is what everybody wanted him to do, he shows up at a funeral for the dead man. And it's the most baffling thing. It's like God shows up late to the funeral, and then he cries. In fact, he cries so much that he outcries every other Middle Eastern mourner, and all the other Middle Eastern mourners are like, look at how much he loved him. It's the most stunning story. God shows up late to a funeral, outcries everybody else, and then raises Lazarus. It's the most extraordinary thing. The story of the gospel is the story of God coming into suffering in the person of Jesus, suffering far more than we would ever have imagined, and then raising us up far higher than we had ever dreamed. What does that mean for you in your suffering, Andrea? It means, it doesn't mean that the suffering goes away, and I'm sorry. But it does mean that there is a God who enters into that suffering with you and can walk with you through the valley of the shadow of death, a God who has experienced suffering himself, a God who has plumbed the depths of all our darkness and come out the other side and can be trusted to bring us through the valley of the shadow of death. That's what Psalm 23 says. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We don't get to be beamed up out of the valley of the shadow. Not even the Son of God is beamed up out of the valley. We all go through, but we go through with Jesus at our head and as our shepherd. And if you can put your hand into his hand, I think you will start to say what Christians, millions of Christians down through the ages have said, which is that I never knew Jesus is all I needed until Jesus is all I had. And in the middle of that suffering, I knew him in a deeper way. That doesn't answer every question that we have, but in a sense, I don't want to answer every question that we have because we still need to have a category for evil that is just evil. But what we really need is friendship in the darkness, and we need a future beyond it. And I think that's exactly what Jesus offers.
That story you mentioned of Lazarus is actually one of my favorite Bible stories. Yeah. I just love the fact that Jesus did have all the answers. Yeah, like all the times I try and comfort someone who's suffering and I don't have the answers for them. I still try and find some to give them. And Jesus literally did have the answers, and he still wept.
And he just cried.
He still met them in their grief. And I just love that. I just think that's beautiful, and such a lesson to us of how to walk with others through grief and suffering. Right. Yeah, because Mary is distraught, and all he does is not, well, you need to understand A, B, and C. It's like he just weeps and then raises Lazarus. You know, it's like he plumbs a depth deeper than we would have imagined, and then raises him to a height that you couldn't have dreamed.
Salt, the church will preserve not just meat, as salt did in the ancient world, but preserve the whole earth. Like light, the church will shine, illuminating the world. But salt and light are influential precisely because they are different from what surrounds them. Salt must be salty, and light must be bright. Salt without saltiness is worthless, just as a lamp under a basket is useless. The greatest need of the church, therefore, is to be distinctively itself. It must not be like the meat. It must not be like the surrounding shadows. We end on this note because the argument of this book could easily be misunderstood. After 10 chapters charting the immense influence of Christianity on the world, perhaps someone will think the world is basically just like the church, and vice versa, which it definitely isn't. Someone might even think the church should be like the world in order to have continued influence, which it definitely shouldn't. Such conclusions completely miss how Christian influence has worked over the centuries. The church has been potent precisely when it has been peculiar. Anyone standing against the evils of their day, like gladiatorial games or infanticide or pederasty or slavery, was considered crazy. The Church may find itself with particular difficulties in the secularized West, but we've been here many times before. In 1925, the author G.K. Chesterton wrote of the many occasions in history when, quote, "the Church has gone to the dogs, but on each occasion it was the dogs that died." How is this possible? Chesterton explains, Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. The kingdom of Christ is unique, and not just in its unparalleled size and longevity. It's different in that while other empires rise and fall, Christ's kingdom falls and rises repeatedly. There has always been an ebb and flow, and always in that order. Anyone concerned by the current Western ebb can look back to millennia of inspiration in Back from the Dead revivals. But they can also look around to astonishing contemporary growth in the world today. By 2060, Pew Research predicts that Christianity will remain the largest belief system on earth, having continued to grow as a proportion of the world's population, while atheism, agnosticism, and the nones will shrink from 16% to 13%. Certainly, the makeup of the Church is shifting towards the East and the global South, with estimates of 40% of global Christians being African by that stage and perhaps half of China becoming Christian. These developments are of immense significance, not least because of the size and importance of China. And therefore, when considering the progress of the Jesus movement, a look around at global Christianity is a great cause for encouragement. But beside the look back in history and the look around at the world, we should look up to the one who knows the way out of the grave. We need not worry about the Church's size or prospects. We ought not to grasp at power as though we are the history makers. We should instead trust in the King of the Kingdom and shine his distinctive light into the world. The future is not in our hands, nor is it in the hands of the powerful, the popular, or the perverse. The government is on Christ's shoulders. And he has promised, Matthew 16, verse 18, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." The end.